Tonight's file was recovered from a crate of things nobody wanted. A salvage lot bought sight unseen from a dealer the archive had not used before, and has not found since. Broken instruments, charts of places that no longer answer. The kind of crate one buys for the smell of old paper and returns on the next cart. We nearly returned it. At the bottom, beneath the ruined charts, there was a file. Real, labelled, cold to the touch, the way a thing is cold when it has travelled a long way. And from the night we shelved it, the small light on its spine would not stay still. Irregular, unhurried, like a pulse. A contented file sleeps as paper sleeps. This one blinked in the dark of its drawer, night after night, the way a lighthouse blinks, certain that somewhere out on the water there is a ship. We waited 12 nights for it to go quiet. It won. The label reads, The Hollow House. Part 1. We begin. The day the junk dug back, Nico Voss was losing an argument with a dead field. Sector 19 had been picked hollow before she was born. Her grandmother's people had pulled the engines. Her mother's had pulled the wiring. What was left lay the colour of old teeth, hull plates gone soft with rust, glass baked white, drifts of shredded cable the reclaimers would not even weigh. But the quota did not care what a field had left in it. 6 kilos of greyed metal by dusk, or the family debt grew another notch in the house ledger. So she dug. Above the fields on the Black Ridge the castle kept its watch. It had a proper name, the seat of House Corvain, keepers of Vesper, a century and a half on the same rock. Nobody in the junk town used it. The town said the Hollow House, and had said it longer than anyone digging that day had been alive, because no light ever stood in those windows, and no sound ever crossed those walls. No music on feast nights, no servants shouting, no dogs. Great families keep to their deep rooms, the old people said, away from the dust. Maybe so. A house with people in it makes noise all the same. That one stood over the town like a stopped clock. Target found the thing an hour before dusk. He was a junk town cat, which is to say a colleague. He rode her shoulders between digs, killed what moved in the cable drifts, and answered to his name about 1 time in 5. He had a ring of dark fur around one eye, as if somebody had aimed him, the whole joke of his name. Her father had laughed about it for a day. She heard him 2 rows over, not mousing, digging. Both paws, tail low, working at a seam of ash and glass she had walked past twice. "That better be food," she told him. It was not food. It was a band of metal, plain as a washer, wide as 2 fingers, the kind of nothing a tired eye throws to the scrap pail. Except that Target had dug for it, and Target did not dig for nothing. And except that when she lifted it out of the ash, it was warm. Not sun warm, kept warm. Old metal, smooth as river stone, warm as a pocket, in a field that had been cold for 60 years. She should have graded it and turned it in. Anything above grade belonged to the house, the first law a scavenger's mother taught, before walking, before reading. Instead, she did the practical thing, slid it over her wrist to free her hands, and went back to arguing with the field. It fit as if it had been measured. She noticed that. She decided not to notice it. The exchange rows opened at first bell, and Nico went in with the band under her sleeve and a plan of the modest illegal kind. At the grey end of the rows, assessors priced a find without asking to see a quota book. Price it, that was all. She never reached the grey end. Horns first. Then wardens walking the crowd back with their arms spread, and the morning traffic of the rows kneeling in waves, and her own knees going down with everybody's. That reflex was taught before reading too. Between the stall roofs she saw it pass, The Lord's Transit, long and black, sealed like an instrument case, windows smoked to slate. No banner, no face. Her father liked to say nobody alive on Vesper had stood close enough to a corvane to smell one. 60 years of smoked glass. On her shoulder, target went still. Not the crouch of a cat measuring a jump. Still the way a stone is still. Ears flat, every muscle stopped. Eyes fixed on the sealed transit until the horns faded off the rose. And then he shook himself once, like a cat coming out of water, and was a cat again. "You and me both," she murmured. But it stuck to her, that stillness. It was not fear. Fear moves. At the head of the rows, a warden captain stepped onto the weighing platform, broke a sealed slate, and gave the town the house's old formula, by grace of the founders. In the keeping of House Corvain, a levy is called upon Vesper, 1 part in 10 of all graded takings, to be rendered in full before founding day, when the gates stand open for the founders' walk. The rose made a sound she had never heard a crowd make. Not anger, not yet. Arithmetic. 1,000 people doing division in their heads. The last Levy had come 8 years ago. The one before that, 15 years earlier. No one had ever read a pattern in them. The house called, the moon paid, and the not knowing when was part of the wait. She looked at the line of wardens holding the platform, and the faces in the helmets were the row's own faces. The baker's second son, a boy she had traded copper with 2 winters back. Warden service brought a family's debt down faster than any field ever would. Her thumb found the band under her sleeve anyway, and worked it toward her hand. It did not come. Not stuck. Not tight. It slid easy to the heel of her thumb, the way it had slid on, and then it simply did not cross, as if the space it needed had stopped being there. She pressed until her eyes watered. The band sat warm and smooth and patient and stayed. "There you are." Her father's voice, close behind her, and his hand landing sure on her shoulder. He was the only person on Vesper who never called her Nico. "Nicole, breathe." "I'm breathing." "You're doing sums with your teeth shut." He steered her out of the crush, down the quiet side of the rows, and his voice stayed light the whole way, the way he kept it light in a collapsing dig. "Everyone's face looks like that today. Walk with me." She walked, wrist pressed to her ribs, and understood, without words for it yet, that she had 2 problems now, and both belonged to the house. That night she took her father's casing spreader from the lean-to wall, thin steel jaws made to open a coil seam a hair at a time, and sat in the dark among the sleeping tools and set the jaws between the band and her skin. She told herself it was caution. A quota search would find it. Possession of an above-grade find was theft from the house, and theft from the house was a number in a ledger big enough to eat her family whole. The truth had more greed in it. She wanted to know what it was worth. First pressure, and the band warmed, like something waking. Second pressure, and a hum came up through the bones of her wrist under hearing, the way a charged line hums through a wall. She should have stopped. She leaned. The jaws slipped. The band did not snap and did not clamp. It poured. Up her forearm, over the elbow, the shoulder, the ribs, thin as paint, fast as a shiver, and she was inside a second skin before her breath caught up to her fear. She went off the stool. The floor took her without a sound, and the floor was information, grain of the boards, grit of ash, the banked heat of the stove across the room, arriving through her palms like a kind of sight. The lean-to was not dark anymore. It stood around her in soft greys, every tool on the wall distinct, the room like a place remembered rather than seen. She got up. Her feet made no sound either. She put her hand to the rack beam and hung her whole weight from it, one-armed, boots clear of the floor. Her fingers did not ache. Then the size of it landed on her, sealed, skinned, held by a thing out of a dead field with no seam and no clasp and no name. She wanted out, with an animal's whole want. And as if the want itself were an instruction, the skin let go, poured back the way it had come, and lay warm and quiet around her wrist. A plain band, the kind of nothing a tired eye throws to the pale. She sat a long time in the dark of the lean-to. It could not be sold. It could not be graded, priced, or explained. It could not be taken off, except that it took itself off when the wanting was true enough. She had not chosen it. It had been dug up for her by a cat, out of a field her family had worked for 3 generations, and it fit as if measured. On Vesper, everything above grade belonged to the house, except, as of 2 nights ago, this. Her father was awake when she came in, boots already on, at the hour that is night for tired men and morning for stubborn ones. "The rows are walking to the gates after first bell," he said. "Over the levy. Somebody has to go and be counted." "They count us fine already." He smiled into his cup, slow, and turned it a quarter turn on the table. "A moon can carry a house, Nicole. It has carried this one my whole life, but a house that grows heavier every year. Sooner or later the carrying has to be spoken about, out loud, in the open. That's all this is." "Then I'll come. You'll dig. No heat in it." He said it the way he graded metal, a fact, sorted. "Stay off the rows today, make quota, be home for supper." At the door he reached back and wrapped his hand around her wrist, around the sleeve and the band, and everything he did not know, the way he used to hold it crossing the fields when she was small. "Lock this behind me," he said. He left before light. The sound reached Sector 19 a little after midday. Sound plays tricks across the flats. The fields eat the middle out of a noise and hand you the edges. A crowd, her father always said, makes weather, a far-off surf sound, rising and falling. What came across the junk that day was not weather, it was punctuation. 3 short sounds, evenly spaced. Nothing around them. Then the flats went back to wind. And the band on her wrist, which had been warm since the field, warm at the stall rows, warm through the whole of the night before, went cold. She was running before she had decided anything. The market square met her clean. That was the wrong of it. There was smoke, one thin column off past the gate road, tidy as a chimney, but the square itself stood swept, stools righted, stones wet, drying in long streaks where brooms had walked them. An hour, maybe less, and the square had been made neat, the way a room is made neat when company is expected. At the well platform stood a line of wardens, and one of them read from a slate, name after name, in a voice flat as a clerk's. The crowd at the square's edge kept the silence she knew from graves. Some names were called for collection. Some names were called for questioning. The word restored was used. The word order. The 9th name was Nico Voss. She did not hear the names after his. She stood at the edge of the swept square inside the crowd, one hand closed around her own wrist, and the castle stood on its ridge with no light in any window, and somewhere between the cold stones and the cold band, the life where she was a digger with a father and a quota and a supper to be home for closed, quietly, like a door at the far end of a long house. On the 3rd evening the junk town buried its dead and did what scavengers have always done. There is no growing ground on Vesper to spare for flowers. What the junk town lays on a grave is a find. one object, dug by your own hands, clean to its shine, the best thing your season turned up, given away on purpose, where nobody can price it. Nico laid down a length of true copper, drawn fine and bright as morning, on the low mound with her father's name. All along the burial rows, small things caught the last light. A gauge glass, a hinge, polished soft, a child's whistle mended. Old Garan came to the mound last, the oldest hands in 19, a digger who had worked the seams beside her father since before Nico could walk. He laid down a crown piece of true bronze, the best thing 50 years in the junk had ever handed him, and stood over it a while, and went back to his crew without a word. When the speaking was done, a woman stood up at the field's edge. Nico knew her the way you know mill names from shift bells and gate lists, Eva Rell of the reclamation mill. Her brother lay under the newest mound but one. She did not raise her voice. It carried anyway, the way mill voices do. They cleaned that square in 1 hour, she said. A breath. Clean it as often as they like. Count what they did not clean. Nobody answered her. Nobody looked away either. Mara Voss came for her daughter through the failing light, a woman who had said almost nothing in 3 days. She took Nico's face in both hands, and her mouth began the name her husband had always used, shaped the first of it, and stopped the way a hand stops an inch from a hot pan. "Nico," she said, "come home." She went. The quota resumed at dawn because grief has never excused a single gram on Vesper, and under her sleeve, against the cold morning, the band had gone warm again, as if nothing had happened, as if it were waiting to be used. 5 nights after the rite, Mara Voss set 2 bowls on the table, sat down across from her daughter, and left her own untouched. "My mother said a thing to me the day I married into the fields," she said. Her mother said it to her, on some other moon, about some other house. I am going to say it now, and then you are going to swear it. Nico looked at the steam rising off the bowls and said nothing. Silence, in that kitchen, had always been a kind of listening. A scavenger owns one thing the house has never graded. Mara turned her hands palm up on the table, worn smooth as tool handles. Nobody sees us. The fields are wide and grey, and we are wide and grey in them, and every year the house forgets our faces a year harder. That forgetting is the roof over this table. That forgetting is what fed you. Somebody wrote his name on a slate, Nico said. Before the square, before the 3 sounds, somebody sat at a desk and dipped a pen. And you want the hand that held it. I want it to know what it wrote. Mara nodded slowly, the way she nodded at a cracked load beam, agreeing the crack was there and deciding nobody would be walking under it. Your father stood up to be counted, she said. The house counted him. It has had a husband from me, it does not get the rest. Swear on your hands. On my hands? Not on his name is done working. The words came out level, a fact, sorted, and Nico heard whose habit that had been, and so did Mara, and neither of them said so. Your hands are not. Swear on what still digs. So Nico laid her palms flat on the table and said it, each word in its place. Stay invisible. Stay alive. She meant it. That much should be said of her. With the bowls going cold and her mother's eyes on her, she meant every word. The house went dark early. She lay on her cot until her mother's breathing found its slow shift-end rhythm. Then she went out to the lean-to among the sleeping tools. Since the rite she had worn a digger's wrist wrap over the band, plain grey cloth, the kind half the fields wear over an old sprain. The one lie on Vesper nobody checks. She sat on the stool where the jaws had slipped, unwound it, and the band lay warm in the dark like something that had been waiting up. Wanting was the whole mechanism. She knew that now. She wanted. The paw took her in one breath, wrist, arm, shoulder, ribs, and the lean-to stood around her in soft greys, every tool distinct on its nail, the night outside arriving through the walls as texture and cold. It was not defiance in her head. It was arithmetic. The house could reach Mara. It could reach the crews, the burial rose, Iva Rell and her carrying voice, the baker's second son inside his warden's helmet, every soul on Vesper, because it could see them. It could not see her. Whoever went to make the house answer would have to be nobody at all. And she was the only nobody on the moon with a second skin. The sum had one name in it, and the name was hers. Stay invisible. Stay alive. She would keep the oath. Both halves to the letter. Her mother had never said one word about staying still. That night she went up onto the high iron above the exchange rows, on grip and quiet, and lay along a beam in the wind, and watched the quota house learn nothing about being watched. She lay in the dark and learned its hours. 4 nights she watched. On the 5th she went in. The quota house stood at the head of the exchange rows, stone to shoulder height and salvage iron the rest of the way up. On its ground floor, the weighing platform and the assay room. Above, behind one shuttered window, the records of Vesper. Every sector's shelf, every family's book, every notch of every debt on the moon. 2 wardens kept the gate brazier through the dark hours. A walking pair went around the building at each quarter bell, regular as dripping water. The clerk slept in town. From last bell to first, the paper that owned the moon lay alone. Target she had shut in the lean-to over one flat word of protest. Some colleagues are not for delicate work. She went up the blind north face on fingertips, quiet as the shadow of a bird. She had stood in the weighing queue beneath that shutter 1,000 mornings of her life. She could have drawn its latch from memory the way other children drew their mothers' faces. Her father's casing spreader opened it a hair at a time, and the jaws that had slipped on the band did not slip on the latch. Inside, the dark was no dark at all. The records room smelled of dust and ink and the particular cold of paper. Shelves ran wall to wall. The town, bound in rows, every family she had ever traded a nail with, spine to spine, sector by sector. Sector 19 kept a middle shelf. The Voss book was old and thin, and she found it without meaning to look. 3 generations of notches, her grandmother's marks, her mother's, her father's, page after page, a working life in tallies. And at the bottom of the last page, in a clerk's clean hand, her father's name with a single line drawn through it, and one word beside the line. Conveyed. The debt had not died with him. It had walked, the same hour he stopped, from his name to her mother's. The house's arithmetic does not attend burials. The assay furnace sat at the platform's edge below, banked for the morning's grading, breathing coal warmth into the dark. On a junk moon you learn fire young, and you learn it obedient. She opened the damper a finger's width and began. She fed it the town's debt, a family at a time, not hurried. A scavenger knows what everything is worth, the first skill of the trade, and she had priced the house's paper her whole life at exactly what it cost her people. Tonight it graded as fuel. It burned steady, batch by batch, the flue drawing clean. She put the Voss book in last. Twice the walking pair came around while she crossed the platform, and twice she stood in the open dark, not an arm's length from a warden's back, wrapped in quiet, and nothing in her was braced. That was the strangeness she carried home. not the fear, the absence of it. Being unseen felt like the first safe thing since the square. She was down the north face before the coals settled, and home before the sky greyed, and the last thing she saw from the ridge above 19 was one thin column off the assay flue, tidy as a chimney. By first bell, the town would wake owing nothing that paper could prove. The Rows that morning were a place she had never been. By the time she came in with her first load, everyone knew. At the weighing platform, the assessors stood idle, like men whose scale had lost its other pan. A claim would come in, and there was nothing to check it against. And the Rows were loud. She had never heard them loud. Somebody at the grey end was singing the shift song with the rude verse in it, at full voice, at mid-morning. Old Garan found her at the scale queue. "Your father graded my best find as slag once," he said without a hello, the way old men resume conversations begun before your birth. A crown piece of true bronze. He looks at it and he says slag, flat as that. Made me carry it 2 sectors to hear another man laugh at me. He watched the idle assessors a while, unhurried. He would have paid a season to see this morning. That is the whole of what I have to say about it. He put his hand on her shoulder, where her father's used to land, and it weighed about the same. Horns, second time in a season. The Rows knelt in their waves, but this was no transit. A warden captain with a sealed slate mounted the weighing platform and stood exactly where the levy had been read. By grace of the founders. In the keeping of House Corvain. Whereas the records of Vesper stand unlawfully destroyed, all quotas are doubled until the said records are restored, and sureties against the peace of the moon will be held, named from the crews. Then the names, in a voice flat as a clerk's. It occurred to her, kneeling on the stones with the band warm under its wrap, that she had never once heard the house speak, except in lists. The Rows made the sound she knew now, 1,000 people doing division. Sector 19's 6 kilos became 12, in every head at once, and under the division ran a slower sum with no answer in it. Restored from what? The house had kept the only books. There was nothing on Vesper to restore them from, and every kneeling row could finish that arithmetic. A doubled quota, with no end written into it. The 8th name on the sureties list was Garan. He rose the way he did everything without hurry. He handed his tools to the boy beside him, an old digger's reflex. Whatever happens, the tools stay with the crew, and walked to the platform on his own legs and did not look at anyone. It is the kindest thing a taken man can do. Not looking. He passed her at arm's length, between 2 helmets with neighbours' faces. Everything the band could do, it did for one skin. The grip, the quiet, the sight in the dark, the not tiring, all of it complete, on her one wrist. None of it reached the arm's length to Garan. She had burned the house's arithmetic. Here was her own. Everything for one. Nothing for everyone else. By afternoon, boots went through every sector. Chests turned out, floors sounded, tool racks counted by wardens who no longer had paper to count against, which made them thorough. She walked home the long way along the ridge, past the field where Target had dug the band out of the ash. She had thought of it, in the dark of the lean-to, in the safe crossing of the platform, as a wall, something to stand behind, something maybe in time for the town to stand behind. It was not a wall. It could stand between the house and her, and nobody else. What it turned aside did not stop. It landed. On the rows, on the crews, on an old man walking to a platform on his own legs. And the house was not a wall either, whatever the town had said of those walls her whole life. The house was a hand. She had watched it reach into the rose twice now. Both times it had come back holding people. The kitchen that night held one lamp, turned low, and two women, and the shape of everything not being said. Mara scrubbed a pot that had been clean for some time. When she finally spoke, it was to the pot. "Garin mended our roof the winter you were born. Would not take a gram for it. Your father fed him suppers for a month and called them accidents." The scrubbing did not stop. One morning, the moon got one morning of owing nothing, and it cost Garin. Whoever lit that furnace handed the house its reason. A breath. All my life it has wanted nothing from us but reasons. Nico sat with her hands flat on the table where the oath had been sworn on them 5 nights before. One morning of breath against Garin, against 12 kilos on every back in 19. It did not balance. She was her mother's daughter enough to know it, and her father's enough to refuse the sum as finished. "Stay invisible," Mara said to the pot, in the voice of a woman saying it to herself. There was ash on the cuff of Nico's digging coat, hanging by the door. There had been ash on it for 2 days. On a junk moon, ash is nobody's evidence. Half the fields end a day grey to the elbow. Her mother had not once looked at the coat. That was how Nico knew she had seen it. She turned the lamp down to a seed and sat while the kitchen went to shadow. On the shelf above the basin, Target folded himself into his loaf shape and watched the dying light with her. A cat's eyes give back what light there is. Anyone who has shared a room with one knows the trick of it. The lamp went out, and for one breath, 2, Target's eyes kept giving. Then he yawned enormously, tipped over on the shelf, and was asleep, a cat like any cat on the moon. "Everyone in this kitchen is keeping something," she told him softly, and got one flick of the tail tip, which passed with him for agreement. In the morning, Garin's crew hung his tools at the head of his row, oiled against the dust. Nobody said for how long. The notices went up on the 3rd morning after the doubling on the quota house stone and at every sector gate. No face. The house had no face to print, only the clerk hand, written large, that persons unknown had unlawfully destroyed the records of Vesper, and that the family of any person giving true information would have its debts cleared. The rows read it in queues, in silence. Cleared. The house had put a price on its burner, and the price was the only coin it had ever minted. Forgiveness of what it said you owed. Nico stood in the weighing queue with 12 kilos on her back where 6 used to ride, and watched her neighbours read the word, and watched every face close over it like water over a dropped stone. Nobody sold because nobody had anything to sell. She had made sure of that, alone, in the dark. The hunt itself had a shape, and the shape was wrong. The wardens hunted a crew. It was in every question they asked, sector by sector, who owned rope, who could rig a scaffold in the dark and strike it before first bell, which mill was missing hooks and line. Sound questions. The face she had climbed was blind stone and salvage iron, sheer, the shutter high under the eave. Without wings you would want 3 diggers and a masthead ladder. The house hunted accordingly, but under the blind face itself, other work was being done, and it was not warden work. The shutter she had opened was gone. Not mended, taken. Off the stone hole, frame and latch together, and the empty socket boarded over neat as a healed eye. Then, on a windless morning, a plumb cord hung from the boarded sill, down the full height of the face, knotted at even intervals perfectly still. Nobody stood near it. It hung there half a day, measuring, not searching for the climber, measuring the climb. By the next morning the cord was gone. No notice changed. No warden's question changed. The loud hunt went on counting ladders, and the quiet one said nothing at all. She turned it over for 3 nights, the way she turned a find she could not grade. Somebody had read that stone and understood. No ropes, no crew, no ladder. Fingers, and quiet, straight up the blind face. And that somebody had folded the understanding away and let the posters stay wrong. The house was hiding her from its own hunt. There was no arithmetic on Vesper that summed that. The loud hunt wanted a record burner, the quiet one wanted the climb. She made the decision on the high iron above the rows, on a night so still the flats forgot to whisper. Garin was a wall away from his own tools, no charge read, no term named. 12 kilos was breaking backs a sector at a time, and the word restored still stood on every notice. And somewhere above the town, patient as a plum cord, somebody was measuring and keeping what they measured. Waiting was not lying low. Waiting was losing slowly with her hands folded. Her mother had asked for invisible and alive. Her father had gone to the gates to be counted out loud in the open. Between the two there was a third thing, and no oath she had sworn covered it. Stand in front of the hand that signs. The hand that dipped a pen the night before the square. Make it answer. Not the town. Not a march to the gates. One nobody, unseen the whole way up, standing in the one room where the house was not a list read off a platform, and asking. The problem was as old as the town's oldest joke. The hollow house had no doors for her kind. Gates for wardens, the Horn Road for sealed transits, and for the junk town nothing but the ridge and the walls on top of it. But a scavenger knows one thing about great houses that great houses never learn about themselves. Everything they throw away comes down. The castle's leavings had been coming down that ridge for a century and a half. Slag, singed cratewood, cracked service iron and paper. Paper is junk too. Fine old plate stock outlives anything the mills press now, and half the tool chests in 19 were lined with it. Some of that lining had drawings on it. 3 evenings she went crew to crew with true copper and small mended things, buying linings out of tool chests, saying it was for damp-proofing her own. By the 3rd night, the lean-to floor held pieces of the castle's guts in lamplight, corner-weighted with grading stones. Water runs, air runs, and in a clerk's faded hand, a long stone throat dropping from the deep kitchens to the tip yard on the ridge's north flank. The road the house's days went down on their way to being junk. The refuse chute. The house's own drawing of the house's own back door, thrown away with the rubbish. Paper lies gently. Ground does not. The next night she went up the flank to read the mouth with her own eyes. The tipyard sat on the flank like a spilled pocket, decades of the house's discards weathering their slow way down toward the fields, and above them, set in the living stone, the mouth, an iron collar, wide as a barrel with the bar screen the drawing had promised. She lay in the rocks a long hour, in the skin reading it. Rust had been at the screen longer than she had been alive, and the air standing in the throat behind it came out dry as the fields, an odd thing for a road out of kitchens. She filed it, the way you file a wrong price. The walking pair came up the ridge road at the hour her watching had promised. 1 patrol, old habit, 60 years bored. She went still the way the skin made easy, routine. Lantern light slid over the rocks above her like weather. Then it stopped sliding. On a rock spine between her and the road, sitting up tall in plain lantern light, was Target. Eyes giving the light back in 2 steady coins, the ring of dark fur like an aim mark, absolutely still, absolutely visible. A cat. On the ridge, where no cat on Vesper had any business a warden could name. The lantern held. Boot leather creaked. One of the pair said mouser, up after the tip-yard's vermin. The other said the eyes stood too high off the ground for a mouser. The first said rocks. And the lantern came off the cat and walked the rocks instead, stone by stone, one slow sweep, and the light crossed the seam where she lay flat and passed the backs of her fingers by the width of a hand. She did not breathe. In the skin, not breathing was only another kind of holding on. The sweep finished empty. The first warden said mouser again, in the voice of a man closing a ledger, and the pair walked on, and their light walked with them, and the ridge went back to dark. She lay in the rocks until her pulse graded honest again. She found him at the yard's edge, washing a paw, immensely pleased with the night so far. She picked him up by the ribs and held him at eye height, and the aim mark eye looked back, unrepentant, from the middle of its dark ring. "Some colleagues," she told him in a whisper with her whole heart in it, "are not for delicate work." She carried him down to the field path and set him on it, facing town, and said home the way her mother said it. He went, unhurried, tail up, a cat keeping his own ledger, in which, whatever this night had owed him, he had plainly marked it paid. She climbed back to the rocks above the mouth to wait out the patrol's next round. And while she waited, the wind came up. She heard it before she felt it, the ridge beginning to sing, the way it had sung on wind nights all her life. The flats wind finding the tip-yard's loose iron and the castle's high stonework, playing them one long breath at a time. Down in the fields, it was weather. At the mouth of a stone throat, it was cover. Inside, on a singing night, her sounds would be the wind's sounds. The drawing had given her the road. The ridge had just given her the hour. No wings, no ladder, no crew, fingers and quiet. The screen came away in her hands like old bread, rust letting go all at once, and she set it in the rocks as gently as a grave gift. The collar beyond was a black circle breathing dry air, older than every det on the moon. One look back. 19 lay below the flank, a thin scatter of lamps going out toward last bell. One of them, too far to tell which, was her mother's. For a century and a half, everything in that house had come down this throat. That night, one thing climbed up. The throat of the hollow house was a long climb in the dark, and the wind sang the whole of it. She went up on grip and quiet, on stone worn smooth by a century and a half of things falling the other way. The skin did not tire and did not slip. Where the throat narrowed, she folded her shoulders and kept on, one hold at a time, her sounds lost inside the ridge's long breath. The chute gave out through a tipping hatch into the deep kitchens, and the deep kitchens were cold. Not banked cold, not morning cold. Field cold. The cold of the seam. Target had dug the band from. The cold of a place fire has forgotten. In the skin's soft greys, the room stood distinct around her, hearths wide enough to roast for 100, coppers ranked on the wall, long tables scrubbed bare. A kitchen made to feed a great house standing at attention, feeding nobody. At the mouth of the chute she had filed a wrong price, dry air on a road out of kitchens. Now she stood inside the answer. Nothing had come down that throat in years, because nothing above it was living the kind of life that leaves leavings. She moved up into the house and it unrolled in front of her, everywhere the same. Halls of sheeted furniture, grey shapes waiting out a weather that never came. Lamps with dry wells, shutters latched from the inside. Door after door unlocked, because a lock is for a house with something moving in it, and past the walls and the gates and the wardens, nothing moved. No guard walked the inside of the hollow house. There was no inside to walk. A house with people in it makes noise. The town had said it her whole life, with a shrug, the way you say things about weather. It was not a shrug, it was a grading. 60 years of looking up, and the town had priced that house exactly right. So she hunted the way a scavenger hunts a dead field for the live seam. The throne wing gave her sheets and dust. The long gallery above the great court gave her echoes. And then, low in the eastern flank, arriving through the soles of her feet, the way the banked stove arrived through the lean-to floor. Warmth. One thread of moving air in a still house. One seam of the hollow house was awake. It was nowhere near the throne wing. She followed it. The seam's road ran through the family wing, and the family wing was kept. Not sheeted, kept. Doors stood open on a long parlour where every small thing sat in its place. A work basket beside a chair, the mending still folded over its rim. A book face down across a chair arm, left so long its spine had taken the shape of its own waiting. In a nursery, a low bed made smooth, and the toys ranked behind glass, dusted, bright, correct as scale weights. On the parlour mantel a clock stood dead. In the next room another clock, dead at the same hour. By the fourth room she had stopped checking weather and started checking when, and it was the same hour on every face, in every room, the whole length of the wing, as if a single night had come for the family of House Corvain and never left. And nothing lived here. Clean rooms, made beds, and not one mark of use anywhere. No path worn into a carpet, no chair shaped by sitting, no small untidiness of a hand that means to come back. The mending stayed folded. The book stayed face down. Whoever these rooms were kept for had not touched them in her mother's lifetime. Kept and not lived in. And she knew the hand. She had seen its work once already, from the edge of a silent crowd. A square swept clean inside an hour. Stones drying in broom streaks, everything made neat the way a room is made neat when company is expected. The hand that swept the square kept these rooms. She stood under the stopped clocks of House Corvain and let the arithmetic finish without her. Whoever rode the sealed transit, whoever called the Levy, whoever's name stood at the head of the moon's every debt. They did not live here. Nobody had, not in her mother's lifetime, and maybe not in her grandmother's. And still below the kept rooms, one seam of the house ran warm. She followed it. She heard the voices before she found the light and stopped moving to be sure. Voices in the hollow house. 2. The seam led her into a service run, a narrow passage ribbed with louvered screens, built so that servants could pass unseen beside the rooms they served. Lamplight stood in the slats of one screen like a blade. She folded herself against the wall and looked through. A plain room, plain the way work is plain. A table, 2 chairs. An old man in grey, small and dry and precise, hands folded on one knee. And standing in the lamplight, a man in shirt sleeves, broad and well-made, reciting, "By grace of the founders in the keeping of House Corvain." A breath. The reciting voice lost its footing, started over. By grace of the founders." "From the beginning," the old man said. No edge in it anywhere, the patience of a man correcting a copybook. Slowly, let the second phrase arrive on its own. She knew the words. Every soul on Vesper knew the words. They came down from the balcony once a year on Founding Day, and off sealed slates the rest of the year in a captain's flat voice. The man in shirt sleeves was being taught it the way children are taught their sums, patiently, from the beginning. Comfort, in a language he did not weigh. "They do not need to love you," the old man said, mild as bedtime. "They need to look up and see that the ceiling holds. That is all a founder's walk is, my lord. A moon looking up at its ceiling, my lord." Through the slats, in full lamplight, she saw what 60 years of smoked glass had kept. The face of the Lord of Vesper. A good face, a calm face, a face like a door with nothing behind it, saying its lesson again, carefully, getting it right this time, pleased for a moment at the old man's nod, and then smooth again, waiting to be filled with the next thing. Her father had knelt to that. The whole moon had knelt to that. She did not know yet what she was looking at. She only knew, with a scavenger's flat certainty, that it graded wrong, a lord who did not own his own words, and an old man in grey who did. The lesson went on behind her, patient as a plum cord. She followed the warm seam down. The seam ended in the warmest room on Vesper. It sat low in the rock, long and clean, the one room in the hollow house being used. Lamps turned low and steady, instruments ranked bright on linen, correct as the assay room. A long bench with a ledger open on it, instrument stands keeping the far end, hooded in grey. And down the room's spine, tanks of heavy glass, tall as a standing man, each with its own small lamp burning at its head, like beds in an infirmary. Most of them stood empty and clear and patient. One did not. She crossed the room the way she crossed a dig that might still shift, and stood in front of the occupied glass and priced what she saw, because pricing was the only thing her hands knew how to do with their stillness. A man, suspended, asleep if that word reached, hands folded the way nobody folds their own hands, younger, smoother, a face not yet finished being a face, like a casting still warm from the mould, and it was the face from the lamplit room above her, the face of the Lord of Vesper, twice, once upstairs, saying its lessons, once here behind glass, waiting its turn. She thought, sideways out of the dark with no reason she could have given, of Target on her shoulder in the exchange rows, gone still as stone while the sealed transit passed. Not fear. Fear moves. He had known before her. He had always known. The band sat warm on her wrist and said nothing as ever. The ledger on the bench lay open in a clerk's clean hand, the house's true voice, the voice of lists, columns of dates 60 years deep. She read dates the way she read prices, and these read her back. 8 years ago, 15 before that, 11 before that. She had knelt on the stones of the rows while a captain read one of those dates onto the moon's back. Everyone on Vesper carried them. The Levy years, the pattern nobody had ever read a pattern in. Here was the pattern. Each levy stood beside its own entry in the ledger, date against date, 1 part in 10 of a moon's takings, rendered in full before founding day. There was no pattern in the sky, and no lean season, and no law. A lord wore out. A levy came. The moon had bought everybody in this room, and the house had called it grace. Nothing noble lived behind the walls of the hollow house. Nothing had in 60 years. There were rooms kept for the dead, and lessons for the grown thing upstairs, and glass for the next one. Copies, and the keeping of copies. She had climbed 1.5 centuries of falling rubbish to stand in front of the hand that signed, and there was no hand. There was handwriting. A house that wrote itself out fresh, over and over, and a moon kneeling to a copy of a copy. The light came up. The light came up without haste, lamp after lamp along the workshop wall, warm and even, the way light arrives when a hand has been resting on the valve for some time, waiting for its moment. She was against the far wall before the second lamp lit, low and coiled, a grey seam among grey instruments. It did not matter. The old man was not looking for her. He was looking at her. He sat on a stool at the head of the occupied tank, a small, dry, folded shape, sitting with the glass the way a nurse sits at a bedside, unhurried, familiar, keeping a patient company through the small hours. The skin had handed her every dark corner of that room. The one thing it could not read was flame. And he had been sitting inside the small lamp's glare all along, still as his instruments. He had let her. 3 traces, he said to the room at large in the voice that had been teaching a lord his letters. A latch, opened without a mark. A fire fed batch by batch, patient as grading. A climb that no ladder on this moon explains. He nodded slowly, an old man agreeing with his own arithmetic. After the 3rd, I stopped asking whether you would come, only which road you would take. He rose, knees first, carefully, the way old men rise, and looked at her across the quiet instruments, and what stood in his face was not alarm, and not anger, and not triumph either. She had stood across a scale from assessors her whole life. She knew appraisal when she saw it. But he was not appraising the intruder. The intruder in his house, at the heart of everything the house had buried for 60 years. The intruder was the part he had expected. His eyes went over her the way an assessor's eyes go over a find that should not exist. The seam of her, the skin of her, the unbroken grey of her. And something moved in his old face that had not moved for the intruder. Wonder. Dry, careful, long-kept wonder. You are not the first to wear it. She ran, not a decision. Her body decided. Through the service door and into the dark runs of the hollow house while the sentence still hung in the lamplight, the skin taking the corners for her, the dry cold throat of the house swallowing her down. And behind her nobody followed, and nobody hurried, and no alarm rose, only the light burning steady in the deepest room, and an old man standing beside his glass, watching the dark where she had been. The wind took her sounds at the mouth. The rocks took her shape on the flank. The fields lay below, grey on grey, her mother's lamp long out among the lamps long out, and she went down toward them carrying the one thing she had climbed for, the truth, whole and heavier than any grade of metal the fields had ever given up. And his voice went down with her, even where the wind sang and would not file and would not stop. That is where the file stops. Not ends, stops. There are more pages. There is, we have checked twice, a second label deeper in, where a label has no business being. We tried regardless to return it to its drawer. The drawer would not take it. Understand that however you like. The runners have warped. The wood has swollen. The archive is old. Or, say it plainly, some files resist being closed. This one is not finished speaking. An old man in a preserved room, unsurprised to find an intruder in his house. Surprised only by what she was wearing. The archive would like to know how a physician recognizes, on sight, a thing older than the house he serves. The file stays on the desk tonight. Its light is still moving. When the archive next opens, so will the file. The archive is closing for tonight.